make some more room. But yeah, you
Hey, Bob.
looks like there's more chairs there. And if you don't want to be back facing, you can always pull them out in the middle if you want. However you want to do it. Did we get it? We got it? All right. Good evening. How y'all doing?
Hello.
All right, thank you all for coming. We'll try to get started right here at 6. We've got a lot going on here. Before I turn it over to our program director over here, real quick, I want to welcome any guests we have. I don't know if we have any guests here tonight. We have all members. We do have one new member that is here tonight for the first time. Scott over here from Decatur with his son, who's recently gotten into woodworking. You can introduce yourself.
Scott Davidson. I'm a teacher in Decatur. I currently teach agriculture. I've been teaching for about 20 years. And Brennan is interested in doing some traditional woodworking and woodworking in general, and it's not something I have a significant amount of experience in. So that's why we're here, hopefully to learn and meet new friends.
Good. Thank you. And you had said before that you yourself, your hobby is is blacksmithing, right?
Yeah, we both blacksmith. I currently got certified to teach the national curriculum for the intro level. So maybe if any of you are interested in dabbling in that or want some hand-made fixtures to go along with what you guys create, that could be something we could talk about more too.
Thank you. Remember dues. If you haven't paid dues yet, I think most everybody here that I'm looking at has already paid dues. I think we've gotten to that point. But if you haven't, please see Bob in the back at some point this evening. Norm's going to pass out some tickets at the end of the evening. We'll draw those. There's some donations for a 50-50, some clamps, hammer, a few other things. And there is, I got an email from somebody. She has a couple of, or he, I'm sorry, gentlemen, he has a couple of antique radios that are starting to delaminate. You know how they used to do that ply with that thin veneer on the outside of them. And in order to fix them, they're going to have to go in a vacuum bag of some sort. And he's trying to reach out to find somebody he can pay to do that. So if you're into that sort of work and you're wanting to do that, let me know. I'll give you his contact information. I think that is all that I have. So I'll go ahead and turn it over to Bob so we can go ahead and get started.
Yeah, tonight our speaker is Bob Ben Keys from Type Bond. He's a chemist. Your title is Technical Services Manager.
That's right.
And you're in the Construction Products Division.
Yes.
So we need your help tonight because we want to learn a lot more about glue.
Okay, so who was here for my last presentation? Okay, so at that presentation we did 5 steps of wood gluing. I've got a new presentation. This is kind of wood technology. I mean, I can redo the other presentation. Normally we get a lot of questions about that. This one doesn't focus as much on gluing as it does on the wood side. You know, why it matters what a tree does and how it grows. Which one? Raise the hands. This one? Okay. So, a little bit about myself. Bob Banke, a technical service manager. I've got some free samples, by the way, up there for everybody. I brought enough for 50, so if you really want 2 of each, there's some boxes that aren't open, or else you guys can give it away at your Christmas party or do some giveaways or raffle them off. I mean, anyway, it's fine. So on each of those bottles is an 800 number. That 800 number is my business card. So I am in charge of the group that answers that phone. So we answer any questions that may come up. And then also I have a group that does some testing. Typically we will, if a new glue comes out, we'll do some testing in the lab, run it through its paces, see how it stacks up against the Type Bond product line. Okay? So this is kind of a question and answer like the last one. I've got a presentation just to kind of go through stuff while you have questions. Raise your hand. We really want you guys to ask the questions, right? So if I don't bring up something that you really want to know, doesn't matter what the subject is, we can talk about it, all right? All right, so when we look at trees, why do we have to understand the wood? Okay, and the reason is wood has a surprising determination to take a particular shape, right? It's going to do what wood wants to do, whether you decide to not put it in that position where it is, right? And so long term, if the wood does not behave well for your project, eventually that project will come apart. And maybe not you, but somebody will be repairing it at some point in time. So we want to take that and avoid these problems by really looking at what is it about wood and why does it do what it does, okay? So to understand wood, you have to look at the source, right? Trees. We look at the upper portion of the tree, but what we don't see is that how large that upper portion is. It's really that large underneath the ground also. So we have to understand that it's a long root structure, and that root structure is there to bring moisture up from the ground and other minerals that the tree needs to grow. Okay? So wood comes in a couple of different, or two different categories, right? Softwoods and hardwoods. Now the softwoods doesn't necessarily mean that they're softer than the hardwoods, right? Because there are some softwoods that are pretty hard, but it's really a scientific classification distinction. Hardwoods, which typically tend to be harder, and that I think that's where the terminology came from. They're typically deciduous trees. They lose their leaves in the winter, typically. Not all of them do. And as a rule, they are stronger. Okay? Now, the other thing about this is I've not given this presentation very often. So, again, it might be a little rougher than that first one. That one I've given probably 150 different times. So this one I think is my 5th time giving this presentation. So now trees, let me just see. So trees will grow typically straight up. But when they don't grow straight up, then there's some issues, right? And this is where you get a differentiation between hardwood and softwoods. So with hardwoods, you get what's called tension wood. Tension wood grows and forms on the high side of the stress. So it's almost like a cable holding it up, right? And that wood tends to be typically stronger than the normal wood. It's difficult to get smooth. So if you ever run into where you're sanding the wood and you just can't get it smooth, it kind of stays fuzzy, you may be dealing with some reaction wood, because in those particular cases, that wood will, the cellulose and the fibers will interlace, making it a stronger wood. Now most of that tension wood is composed of cellulose. And why do we care? Well, cellulose is what wood glues bond to. Okay? So the chemistry of this is all in these hydroxyl groups, or the oxygen-hydrogen bonds. Who here thinks that wood glues bond through the pores of the wood? Well, my statement to you is if you have that in your head that it does, my question is, what would be the strongest bond that you could get then? Would it not be end grain to end grain? Right? I mean, you've got tons of pores, and the glue soaks down those pores. We all know that because in some cases you get a starved glue joint. So we know it goes into the pores of the wood on both sides. Yet that bond is weaker because what the wood glue really bonds to is the cellulose. And there's very little cellulose on end grain. If you look at a picture of end grain, it's like bonding to the ends of straws. A lot of air, very little cellulose. And how that works is these oxygen groups love electrons. And this is the chemistry side of it, so again, if I bore you to death, I apologize. But the oxygen molecules love electrons, right? And so it's going to pull those electrons away from the hydrogen, and the hydrogen is like, yeah, go ahead, take it. I don't really like it anyway. I like to be by myself. And so what happens is you get a net negative charge on the oxygen and a net positive charge on the hydrogen. And so what you end up with is something similar to a neodymium magnet. Okay? And if you look at just this one molecule, you have 3 hydroxyl groups for every sugar. This is actually a glucose molecule hooked together, right? It's just sugars. The tree produces sugars from the carbon dioxide in the air, combines it with the water, forming the sugar molecules. And so these hydroxyl groups, which are like little neodymium magnets, but there are a lot of them, right? And so it's kind of like taking a neodymium magnet and putting it on your refrigerator. Relatively easy to pull one of those off. Now let's put 3, 6, 9, 10, 12 of those magnets on and then try to pull them all off at the same time, right? You'll pull the door right off at some point in time. And so this is what we want to do for the wood glues. The wood glues themselves are PVA, water-based wood glues are PVAs, polyvinyl acetates. And these are, the polyvinyl acetate, the vinyl acetate doesn't really stick to wood. It's what we put in the mixture to help them stay stable in the water so that, you know, if they're really just little microscopic balls of plastic that float in water. And I think if you guys have been here for the other one, we've seen pictures of those. If they weren't stabilized in the water, they would all settle like marbles in a jar of water, right on the bottom. And in some cases, you've seen a glue that's been sitting around a while, and you stir it, and it tends to be real muddy on the bottom. Well, those are all those particles. The heavier particles will tend to sink just due to gravity. They have more volume per surface area, and so they have less ability to stay distributed in the water or in the mixture. And so what happens is they tend to settle. But anyway, the polyvinyl alcohol, which we use to stabilize the particles, has the hydroxyl groups on there. And that's what bonds. And so the wood glue has a similar structure to this. And so what happens is they like to settle together in what we call hydrogen bonding. And so in these particular cases, the hydrogen will associate with that oxygen from a different molecule, and they'll kind of link together. And the reason why cellulose is so strong versus starch, both are made with sugars, is that the cellulose will have an oxygen bond between the molecules that's up and down, whereas with the starch will have them all in the same direction. What that does, believe it or not, is allows those magnets to get just a little tiny bit closer together. And we know that that's very effective, and why I'm going to talk to you about wood gluing is that the closer the magnet gets to the other magnet, the stronger the bond, right? If I took a neodymium magnet, put it on the fridge, and put a postcard in between, is it easier to pull off? Absolutely, because it's farther away from the metal or from the other bonding structure. And so what happens is, because of that, cellulose, which sits a little bit closer together, you have to boil that at 320 degrees and put it under 25 megapascals of pressure, a lot of pressure, just to get it to soften and dissolve. Whereas with starch, which doesn't have as close of a structure, can be dissolved in just boiling water. So again, just some of the little chemistry of the wood itself to understand what a tree goes through when it grows. Now, with softwoods, you get what's called compression wood, and these form on the underside of a bough. And this is like a little beam kind of holding up that branch or the tree if it grows bent over, right? And now with softwoods though, these, again, widely spaced growth rings, and we'll get a picture to kind of show you what those look like. But that wood tends to be weaker than the rest of the wood. Again, it's brittle, more likely to split, And it will change in terms of expansion contraction with moisture much greater, 10 to 15 times more. And that's why when you see some of these, veneers that have this really funky grain pattern, right? In a lot of cases, that grain pattern is caused by the fact that the tree didn't grow in optimum conditions, which would be straight up and down. And so you get some of this as you peel or slice those veneers off of there, you'll get some of that compression wood or tension wood in there. And so they will tend to expand and contract more in one area of that veneer, and so tends to want to warp and twist a little more, okay? So you get an understanding in those particular cases of what's going on. Now, compression wood is very high in lignin, okay? So lignin is a little bit different, much more complex, a little less, water loving. It's more hydrophobic than hydrophilic. And so this is how the tree grows. Most of the tree is 50% lignin, about 50% cellulose. Cellulose tends to be on the inside of the cells, which tend to wick water up because water is polar also, oxygen, hydrogen, right? And so it's very, attracted to that cellulose. Whereas with these groups, they have a lot more hydrocarbon texture to it, more waxier by nature. And so they sit on the outside, and they're kind of the glue that holds the tree together. And it tends to be more brittle, okay? And that's how a tree functions. And when we look at the tension wood, we can see the larger growth rings on there in a lot of cases, right? And so let's say I want to make a spoon, okay? So when we look at carving a spoon, we want to make sure that that wood is very strong, right? Where would the best place now, if you know this about trees, what would be the best wood in this particular situation to make a spoon or carve a spoon with? In that particular case, you'd want tension wood, which is, as we saw in the previous slide, stronger, typically stronger than the regular wood. And the grain pattern is more intermixed so that it will not split along the grain lines as easily. And so we want to take a look at some of the wood there, and really all branches are going to be reaction wood, right? Because a branch is not growing straight up and down, it is growing out there, and so you get the softwoods and hardwoods growing differently. And again, in a lot of cases, the wood there may actually be better for making spoons on a branch.
Question?
Yes?
The wood that like we were talking about in a fork of a tree, crotch of a tree, and the wood is splitting off and going, the grain is going off into this big limb. So like in walnut, you'd have this fancy grain.
Mm-hmm.
I can understand that part of it. But where there is, like, I've heard it referred to as fiddleback, like in maples,
Mm-hmm.
like violins and gun stocks and stuff like that made out of. What actually, and it's a whole, I've seen it to where it's the whole board.
Mm-hmm.
The,
Gets a certain pattern to it.
yeah, it's some of it's waves,
Mm-hmm.
some of it's, like you say, that fiddleback, where it's just like soldiers lined up in a row. What causes that?
And this, in a lot of cases, those are by the genetics of the tree itself,
Okay.
okay? In the length of each of the cells, and we'll go through what those look like, and how the different lengths stack up together, right? And so light will hit those if they're in a certain arrangement
Right.
and throw the light back at you instead of dispersing, right? And that's where you get the chatoyance of certain trees, which is that, where you go from this angle, you can see that it shines back at you, this angle it does
Right.
not. And that has all to do with how the tree builds those cells.
I've seen it, if you have a, if you find that fiddleback or
Mhm.
wave,
Mhm.
it's typically in the whole tree. That's what I've
Right,
experienced.
right.
From where it comes out of the ground, even out into the branches.
Yep.
It has this wave going.
And that will have to do with a certain genus of the tree and then how it grows. The same with, say, the bird's eye maple, which basically grows because it forms a lot of little stems off as it grows.
I've never encountered any bird's eye maple.
Yeah.
It'd be neat.
So anyway, any other questions? So when we look at how does a tree grow, it grows from the middle to the outside, right? The tree really only lives by a layer of cells that are just underneath the bark. That's it. The rest of the tree, other than 2 to 3 layers of cells that grow between the bark and the wood, the tree is pretty much dead. Okay? So the living portion right around the outside. As it splits, as those cells split, one of those cells goes to be bark, the other cell grows to be the inside of the tree, or what we would consider the wood. Now the tree needs the bark because bark protects that cellular structure, protects the living portion of the tree. Now if you have woods and you decide to cut trees down and then the sun starts to hit the trunk of the tree, you can actually sunburn and kill the tree on that side. Because the bark hasn't grown up enough to protect it, right? So the bark you can consider as like the skin, right? And as the skin, it gets UV light, and wood does degrade over time under UV light, and that's why the bark typically isn't as thick as the wood. It gets washed away, gets damaged, and moves on. Whereas on the inside of the tree, it starts to grow layers, right? And in the spring, it grows very fast. Towards the end of summer, it grows slower, and that is where you get the ring structure from the trees. So the trees are all interconnected. All of those cells as they grow are all interconnected. And they have to be interconnected if you think about it, because water has to get from the roots of the tree all the way to the top of the tree. So if you took a pipe and put a vacuum on it, how far could you vacuum up water?
32 feet.
About 32 feet. How tall is the tallest tree? 300 some feet, right? Some of these trees can get about 300. So it's amazing that the tree can take this water. It doesn't have pumps, it doesn't have electricity, but because of the size of the cells and the surface tension of the water, and the fact that as the leaves transpire this water out, it pulls up more from the bottom. Okay? So what we don't want to do is, and the reason with, say, a flower and stuff, if you cut it and you get an air bubble in there, then if you put it back in the water, it can't transpire out, right? So you break that line. So that tree is full of moisture, and in a lot of cases, it may have 200 to 250% of the weight of the wood in moisture, okay? And the whole amount of the tree right back behind the growing portion is what helps to transport that water, okay? And then part of that, as it gets further away, then transports some of the nutrients that the leaves manufacture back down through the system. And so it's a very complex system. And these pores and pits that you see in the wood help to carry that moisture up through the wood. So how do we get boards out of trees? We have some sawyers in the room?
I've got a wood man.
What? A wood miser?
Yeah.
Okay. So you do mostly plain sawn boards then?
If they want quarter sawn, if the log's big enough, you can quarter sawn.
So you quarter saw. Because I'm going to ask you a question, because I've looked at a lot of the literature, and I've talked to a couple of sawyers, and so when you get wood out of a board, again, we look at plain sawing, which is basically just taking the log and just sawing some boards out of it, right? And as we note, you see the grain changes as we go through each of the boards, right? And so in this particular case, these boards are more rift, what's called rift or quarter sawn in structure. And what we do is we look at what is the angle of the grain to the surface of the board. And we'll note why that makes of note. So on a plain sawn board, truly plain sawn, that's where you get your good cathedraling in your board. And you'll see that that's going to be mostly out in this area. As you get here, the grain in some cases gets a little more boring, straight up and down. Oaks can give you some of that. There's a term for that. Just can't pull it out of my head right away. So the other one is quarter sawing, and this is not, as somebody has told me, how quarter sawing is done. But in this particular case, you're looking for grain that is more perpendicular to the face of the board in that particular case. Rift sawing, again, there's some controversy of what is rift and what is not, and what is quarter sawing. So basically in those cases, when we look, what's the difference is really how these boards are pulled from there. This one doesn't have it. Let me go to the other slide. And the gentleman that I had talked to, who is a sawyer, I mean, that was his job before he worked for our company, was he worked in a sawmill. His father owned a sawmill. And this is how quarter sawing is typically done. Okay? Basically, you take the log, cut it in quarters, you saw off this piece, turn it on the side, then you saw off this piece, turn to the side, saw off this one, saw off this one, saw off this one, as it goes. And again, plain saw, again, they talk about rift sawing this way. Again, there's questions people have on there. There's no real true one that you want to know, other than for rift saw boards, the angle is supposed to be much more perpendicular to the face of the board. Quarter sawn allows for more of an angle. Again, I've heard it both ways.
Quarter sawn is more perpendicular.
And I understand, I've heard it both ways, but what I've heard mostly is that with quarter sawing, especially with this, you're going to get different angles. Whereas with the rift sawing, which is supposed to be always towards the center of the board, that's where you get more of the grain that is perpendicular. That, I mean, again, I've given this presentation and we've had disagreement every single time.
We didn't want to ruin your record.
And understood. So again, there are many ways to get boards out of there. Really the thing that you're looking at is, do you want the cathedraling, or do you want more of a straight grain pattern? So when we cut a tree down, we have what's called free water and bound water. Okay? Free water is that water that is just in the cells of the wood. It's not bound to any cellulose, and that can, like I said, be up to about 250% of the weight of the tree, of the wood itself. Okay? As we get rid of that and go down to the bound water, wood will not expand and contract until the free water is gone. And typically that's going to be around 30% moisture content. Once it hits 30% moisture content, then the wood will start to shrink. The problem is wood does not shrink equally in each direction. And depending on how the tree grew, it may not shrink even the same within the tree itself, right? And so the people who dry the wood will tell you it's more of an art than it is a science. And so when we look at a tree and how it grows, let me see if I've got that picture. Yeah, we'll talk about it later. But anyway, so as we dry the tree, there's going to be certain areas of the country where moisture is going to be higher than in other places. So along the coast, you're looking at 11 to 13% moisture content, which would be standard if you air dried the lumber, right? And even if you got it out of a kiln at 8%, which is what they're supposed to give it to you, once you put it in your area, if you're along the coast, it's going to get to that 11 to 13%. And if not, your furniture that you build or your projects will eventually get to that anyway, right? And that's what we find. We find a lot of problems occur because people will, it seems, all of the furniture built in Arizona gets sold to the coastal people or vice versa. And so what happens is along the coast, you got higher moisture content, you bring it into Arizona, it goes down to 5, and that whole tabletop that you just made will shrink. And why does that matter? Well, again, when we look at how a tree grows, from the base of the tree to the top, that would be considered the longitudinal direction, and we really can ignore that because it doesn't shrink much at all in terms of the longitudinal direction. When we look at the radial direction, which is from the center of the tree to the outside of the tree, we can consider that X. And each tree will have a different X, right? And poplar that's grown down south and poplar that's grown in Minnesota will tend to have a different X. It really depends on how fast the tree grows. And so that amount of expansion contraction can vary between different regions of the same species. But typically, if they're harvested in the same area, in the same places, similar light structures and all of that for growing, they can be pretty close. When we look at the tangential direction, which is the movement around the outside of the log, that's going to be about 2x. Okay, and that's the reason why when you air dry a log, in a lot of cases, you will see that log split. Because the outside of the log, as it dries, wants to shrink an inordinate amount, twice as much around that outside as it does shrinking to the inside. And as the outside dries before the inside does, it wants to start that cracking process. And that's why you'll see them running sprinklers on some of these logs outside, because they're trying to more evenly dry them, because they don't want the outside of those logs to dry quicker, because then they tend to split. And then when you go to saw them, you get boards that you have to throw away, and it's not very good or profitable for the sawyer. So we look at the least movement in longitudinal, most in tangential, less in the radial direction. And why does that matter? When we look at plain sawn boards, we have what I consider a rainbow effect on the ends of the board. Right? And when we look at that, we have more grain on the top, more tangential grain on the top than we do on the bottom, which means that the top is going to shrink more than the bottom of that board. And when that occurs, we get some warping. And typically what will happen is the board will curl or cup. And that's normal, right? And that's why when we are putting boards together for a tabletop, some will say, put them all in the same direction so that they warp all in one, and then it's easier to hold them. Or the other one is interlace them, but then you get a wavy structure. So my question is, which one is right? I don't know, it depends on what project you guys are doing. But what I can tell you is if you're making a tabletop out of these, you want to make sure that the moisture content of that wood is going to be where that table is going to be used. Because you're going to be planing these boards flat, right? And if you send it with, say, 10% moisture content, and you send it to Arizona, it goes down to 2, that tabletop, which was dead flat, mirror flat finish, looks great, is now going to have a wavy ripple, and they're going to be calling you because that table was $10,000 that you just sold him, and he's not going to be very happy with that, right? Or you need to tell him that this table may at some point in time get some ripply effect to it, and that's what you had determined it to be in the first place, and that's your artistic talent. When we look at quarter saw boards, right, in this particular case with the grain running perpendicular to the face of the board, most of the shrinkage now is going to be, because now this is the tangential direction, right, is going to be in thickness, and less so in width, as a percentage of the movement. Now, where does this come into play? We get a number of calls on this particular problem. And the call will start off with, your glue is extruding from the glue line. And my statement normally, because we've had so many calls, so I like to play with people a little bit, and I apologize if any of them are you. But my statement back to him is, well, how much pressure do you have on that table? Right? And the guy goes, there's no pressure on the table. It's a table. You don't understand woodworking. And my statement back to him is, well, you don't understand physics. Everybody's tried to scrape dry glue, right? Soft and gooey? No. Hard as a rock. So my statement back to you, because what they'll say is, I feel a little ridge of glue on my project. And they'll say, it's extruding from the glue line. I'm like, how can it do that? If you don't have pressure on there, and you've gotten the glue to extrude from the glue line, you've violated the laws of physics, and we're all going to be rich. Free energy, right? But what happens is when you glue up a board, when you glue a board, especially with a water-based adhesive, a couple things can happen. One is you're going to expand the wood along the glue lines where it has absorbed moisture. If you then take that tabletop that you did and sand it right away, you're going to be sanding swollen wood. As the wood equilibrates, dries back out, that wood is going to dip down as it shrinks. And what you're going to feel is a ridge of glue because the glue doesn't shrink with moisture. The other thing that can happen is if you start off at 12% moisture content and you ship the table to Minnesota or this area in the middle of winter where it's 10 degrees below zero, you're pulling in air that is very low in moisture content. Now you're heating it, the relative humidity goes even lower. Moisture content of your wood in your house may get down to about 4 to 3%. Minnesota, we've seen it down to 2%. And in that case, same thing will happen. The wood will shrink, the glue lines will not. And in some cases, we've seen where that finish that you put on there now has popped and there's white lines all the way down the glue lines. And you're going to tell me that my glue sucks and it's causing these issues because it's the glue lines. But it's not the glue, in a sense, right? It is the glue, but the glue just doesn't expand and contract with the moisture. Now, this can happen on a seasonal basis. And you can, if your table goes down to 2%, it's going to go back up in the summer. They'll disappear again. The only way to get rid of them is to sand them at the driest point that wood is going to be. And then what happens is as the wood expands, your finger can't feel a divot. Okay? So these things are important to understand to go through. Now we want to know that the percentage changes in moisture varies from species. We talked about that. Content of sapwood is generally higher than that of the heartwood in terms of how it dries and moves. So the heartwood is going to be different than the sapwood. No two trees are exactly alike. Chances of board being same along the entire length is probably nil, because and we've all seen as the tree grows, right? And you've seen where the tree will twist a little bit as it grows too, right? So the wood will have a bit of a twist. It's not going to be straight, constant up and down that board, right? So what this really comes down to is we've got a plan for this movement. When we build our projects, we have to know that that wood is going to move and understand that. If I've got a cabinet where the wood is moving in this direction, and I put a trim piece on that moves in this direction, this is easy for me to say. This is not transverse, it is a longitudinal direction on the trim, right? And possibly either radial or tangential on this, right? So basically the side of the cabinet is going to move more than the trim. Now how do you deal with that? Now a lot of the high-end manufacturers will put a sliding dovetail in there, let it slide in and out, similar to like breadboard ends on a table, right? If you don't account for that, what happens? The table will crack. And that's because you've got longitudinal direction versus tangential direction. The wood is going to move. You've got to allow for that to occur. And in some cases, it's not going to be even along the whole side, right? If it's cut here, which is the middle, say if I'm plane sawing those boards, these boards that cut from the middle are going to be very different from the ones that are cut from the top in terms of movement. Do I want to put plane sawn and quarter sawn boards together on a table? I don't know, right? Depends on the look that you're giving. But you've got to realize that they're going to move differently also, right? This board is not going to change in thickness as much as this board is. And so in some cases you may get a step joint in a table as it dries.
In your example of quarter sawn being edge glue, is there a better choice than PDA than edge glue and quarter sawn to kind of help with that if you've got some?
So the hide glues will expand and contract with moisture similarly to wood. And that's why you don't notice it as much on like the older antiques and stuff, because it did move with the wood a little bit. But the problem with that is if you do have an area where it is 10 to 12% moisture content of the wood, that glue will soften because it's not resistant to humidity. And I have a piece of paper I put some hide glue on. It acts as a hygrometer, right? And when it's dry winter weather, that curls up into a tight little tube, and then in the summer it uncurls, right? Because the glue shrinks and swells with the moisture changes. Well, one summer, our air conditioner went out and it got so humid in the office, that glue actually ran off of the paper down on the carpet. So that becomes the issue with utilizing hide glue, right? I mean, there are some advantages to it, but there's disadvantages. And there really is no glue out there which is perfect for every job. So we got to kind of have to get an idea of what we're doing with our project, right? So
Bob, you're saying don't put your antique furniture in the attic.
well, or the basement, right? So hide glue wants to really works best at more of a constant temperature. You don't want it to get. Actually, it gets very strong when it's dry. It's really that moisture, that humidity that causes it to change. So this is just a kind of a little exercise that we look at here on really how much movement wood actually has. So in this particular case, it's a gymnasium floor. The formula and you can scientifically, if you want, you can measure that change. Because all wood will have what's called a coefficient or shrinkage coefficient, okay? Which will tell me about what that type of wood is going to expand and contract with moisture differentials. And so you have your change in moisture times your shrinkage coefficient times the face width of the wood, right? And so when we look at that, let's say we've got a basketball floor. Before it floods, it's 8% moisture content, which is typical for this area of the country. After flooding, I mean, it could be 100%, but we don't care, because 30% is where it really kind of changes for movement, right? Above 30%, it doesn't move anymore. Most of that then goes into free moisture. It's just going to take you longer to dry your floor out without any movement. And a basketball floor, about 60 feet in length, 720 inches. So the expected change is 22% change in moisture times the coefficient, which is 0.00202, and that is movement per movement, right? So if it's inches to inches or feet per feet, it's a how do you say, ratio, thank you. And then times the 720 inches. So that floor will change 32 inches. So if we have this floor and it is butted up against the walls, and we force the floor to stay glued down, what will happen? It'll push the walls right off of the foundation and maybe collapse the building. So we want a glue to glue the floor down in this particular case that actually will release at a certain strength so that we don't push the walls off of the foundation and cause the building to collapse. So again, we want to look at utilizing that, the glue for what our projects are going to need in terms of movement, right? So this we're going to go through a little bit fast. When we talk about grain, so when we get calls and stuff, we want to make sure we're talking and we're all on the same page, right? So grain can mean a lot of things. It could be end grain, face grain, side grain, which way the board was cut, which way the grain goes. You got edge grain, vertical grain, rift, bastard grain. We can go against the direction of the wood, with the direction of the wood. And that's important because the wood tends to break easier along the spring wood, right? The wood is weaker in the spring wood than it is in the late wood, right? Early wood versus late wood. What this means for gluing is, let's say, I believe that wood glue does not bond to cellulose, but I believe that it's more of a mechanical bond. So I'm going to take it and I'm going to sand it with an 80 grit to roughen up that surface texture so I get more surface area to glue. The problem that occurs when I do that is that I damage the fibers. And so now I'm gluing to damaged fibers along the surface. Everybody's had a little wisp of wood that they're like, oh, I could just pull that off. Pull it and it goes down into the grain. This is what occurs when you rough sand a board and then try to glue it. What will happen is the glue will bond to those damaged fibers, and then as you pull it apart, it'll break into the grain of the wood from those damaged fibers. Now it looks like you have wonderful, wonderful wood failure, and the glue did exactly what it was supposed to do. But if you actually took that and measured the strength of that wood, you would be, in some cases, 25 to 50% weaker. So we recommend, so the best surface to glue to is one where the cellulose is very strong, the grain is not damaged, and typically 220 to 320 grit if you're going to sand. The problem is if you use a sander that has high speed, you may burnish the wood. What happens when you burnish the wood? When you burnish the wood, those hydroxyl groups all get burned off. They get turned into carbon dioxide, and you end up with a layer of carbon on the surface. Carbon is not easy to bond to. So those areas that look burned, dark black in there, glue won't bond to that. If you notice that your surface is a little bit shiny or polished, that means that the upper surface has been burnished. and the glue won't bond to that. So because it's not a mechanical bond, it's to those glues, those burnish surfaces can sometimes be only 10 to 20% strength. Now, in some cases, is that fine? Absolutely. How much stress are you putting on the tabletop? Right? So if the glue is typically, like Type 1-3, 4,000 PSI, and I'm at 10%, I'm still at 400 PSI. 1 square inch, glue it to the wall, I can hang a 400-pound person on that. Is that strong enough for your project? In a lot of cases it is. However, if I'm gluing a chair together and I'm going to rock back on that, is that going to be strong enough? Absolutely not. Right? If I've got dovetails, which are mechanically locked anyway, does that matter? No. As a matter of fact, on a dovetail, do I actually have to glue every surface on there? No, because the joint itself is mechanically locking it in place. So we understand what the wood is doing. It adds mechanical strength depending on the type of joint that you cut also. We have to understand what the glue is doing, right? Would we do a butt joint to a side joint and then make a chair from that? No, because it's not that strong. And what we want to do is we want to cut joints that increase the amount of side grain or cellulose that is in contact with the glue. And that is what we try to do as woodworkers, right? So again, grain, structure, some of the pretty fiddleback woods. Grain can also refer to defects in the wood. In some cases, very beautiful. And that is why we work wood, right? Because of the texture and the look of the wood itself. And all of that, if you think about that, all of that is based on how large those cells are, how they're spaced together between them, and how light interacts with those as it reflects back. And we note that when we have a rough surface, that rough surface will tend to make the light go in different directions. But as we put a finish on there, that allows the light to move in one direction and hit the wood all in going in one direction. And so it reflects back in those directions. Okay? So when we look at a knot is really just a branch. One of the things that we have to understand is if a branch has gone through there, we also have to note that anywhere where a branch was, we're going to get that tension wood or that reaction wood, right? And so the wood around that is going to act a little bit differently. In some cases, it may be more brittle on a soft wood. On a hardwood, it may be a little bit tougher, but also won't sand as well, right? So we want to make sure that that's probably why we, visual defects. So buying softwood, typically, I mean, I'm not going to go into a lot of this. Again, it'll get you guys falling asleep after a while. If you have any questions on that, how to buy hardwoods local. So really that's all I have for you guys, because it just goes into some of the detail if you want to go into what, number one common, first and seconds, things like that. And then some of the defects that you go through. So any questions? Again, this one wasn't as, focused on the gluing portion of that. So this is part of the old one. I'd like to go through a little bit on what happens when the glue dries. And just kind of go through that again, just to get you guys to understand. This is what a water-based wood glue looks like under a microscope. That's it. What sticks to the glue, to the wood, is this little layer that's around the outside. That's the polyvinyl alcohol. That's what sticks to the wood. Okay? So as the glue dries, those particles get closer and closer and closer together until they start to touch. Now, we've all rubbed glue between our fingers, very slippery initially, until we get to what I call the putty point, right? At that point, if you took that glue that had gotten to its putty point, rubbed it on a piece of wood, put the glue together, it would not bond that wood together very strongly. And the reason is because the particles now cannot flow. If the particles can't flow, those little neodymium magnets cannot sit tightly together, right? So that glue has to flow onto the surface. So at what point is that putty point? Typically, theoretically, if all the particles were the same size, and they're not, but we can consider them to be close to that, be about 33% water I can still fill in this jug with the marbles. So what that means is that 67% solids, around 67% solids, the glue starts to not flow any longer. Now, most wood glues are going to be around 45 to 50% solids or particles. The rest is water. So if you have about 17% water to play with before the glue starts to set. Now, we can do a few things chemically to cause it to set a little bit faster, which we do with Titebond Original and Titebond 2. And we can do stuff to make it set a little slower, which we do with Titebond 3. So, again, what you want to note is that there is an open time, and that open time is the time where that glue first hits the wood, right? And you all have done finger gluing, right? Spread the glue, and it's always, when you first do it, gets real draggy, right? Initially. Well, that's because immediately that wood has sucked the moisture out of your glue, and you have formed a putty line or a putty film of that glue on the surface, right? So I have to put more glue on to get it slippery again so that I can put the board on and it will transfer to the other board. The open time is where you have water evaporating into the air and the water being sucked into the board itself. Once you get the pieces together, now it's just the wood sucking the moisture out, right? And so we want to be cognizant that Titebond Original and 2 were designed to be very similar in terms of their wet characteristics, which means the glue up characteristics. It has a 5-minute open time, and then you got another 5, maybe a little bit longer, to get the boards clamped. Because once the glue has gotten to the putty point and I move the board, I have just moved the glue, and the glue can't flow back together again. I then will have introduced a line of air particles in there, which will cause a weak area of the glue line, which will break at a much lower strength. So, and as you get further and further and further past that putty point, that glue line will get weaker and weaker and weaker and weaker, right? And so we want to be cognizant of what that is. So who is a single-sided gluer? Raise your hand. Two-sided gluers, raise your hand. You're all correct. There is no wrong way to do this, okay? But each one will give you an advantage and a disadvantage, right? So if you want to have invisible glue lines, you have to be a single-sided gluer. Why is that? Because as soon as the glue touches the wood, you're forming a glue line. If I put glue on both sides, my glue lines are always going to be twice as thick, right? If you want those little tiny pearls of squeeze out, you have to be a single-sided gluer. However, because you got so little glue there, it's going to putty up very fast on you, and you better get your joints together very quickly. So you have to be much more cognitive of it. If you're a two-sided gluer, you're going to use twice as much glue, and we thank you. You will get a little more time to put it together because you have much more moisture, right? So I've satisfied the moisture on this board by putting glue on it. I've satisfied the moisture on this board by putting glue on it. And for the most part, unless I've air dried it for a very long time, usually 10 or 20 minutes, I'm going to have some wet glue in there for it to then move together, especially as I'm squeezing stuff out, right? Because with a two-sided gluing, that's one of the downsides is you have a lot of squeeze out. And again, we thank you. So again, there's no good, there's no bad. I wouldn't recommend one way or the other than to say if you want invisible glue lines, you have to be a single-sided glue.
What about thin versus thicker? It seems to me like if it's too thick, the inside of where the glue is not gonna get very hard because it's not touching wood. So what do you recommend about thin versus thicker?
So actually, we have looked at clamping strength, right? So we did a test on clamping strength. Because our typical recommendation is for softer woods, about 100 PSI clamping strength on your clamps. For medium density like maple, about 200, 150 and then 200 for your harder woods. What we have realized is we're wrong. Okay? So we ran a study, and the reason we ran it, somebody sent in some Jatoba and said, usually the calls start with your glue socks. I've worked for other companies that I couldn't say that wasn't the case, but the quality systems for this company are so good, I know it's not going to be, that's not the case. It's not the glue. What we found out, so he sent the Jatoba in, he said I was gluing it up, he did everything right, wiped it with acetone, all of those things. Because remember, with a tropical wood, the tree, because it can't move away from danger, insects that want to eat it, the trees actually perform chemical warfare. Okay, so the tree produces resins, it produces acids, it produces oils, and that's all to, how do you say, get in the way of bugs being able to digest the cellulose, which if you can get to the cellulose, digest the cellulose, you got a supply of sugar, right? So the tree's going to do that. So what you want to do with the Jatoba, we typically recommend wiping with acetone before gluing up to remove any oils or tannic acids or anything else that is going to get in the way of the glue getting to the cellulose, right? So that's our goal as woodworkers, to get a strong bond is we want pure cellulose that the glue can bond to. So that's why wiping with acetone will always get you a better bond, even with your domestic woods. If you ever took some maple and boiled it to dye veneers, that water turns a dark, dark black tea color. I mean, there are that many chemicals in that wood. And again, cleaning the wood off to get to the cellulose will always give you a strong bond. Now is 4,000 versus, say 25% less, 3,700, going to make a big difference? In a lot of cases, no, it's still going to be stronger than the wood. But if you're starting to get failures on the wood, then we need to start thinking, well, what's going on? What am I not doing to get that strong bond? Because even with Ipe, has anybody worked with Ipe? It is the oiliest, nastiest wood you'll ever work with. You'll wipe it with acetone. What we recommend is you wipe it with a rag, white rag, until it comes back clean. That rag will never come back clean. You'll get tired of doing it and you'll glue it up anyway. And it'll be strong enough in most cases. I had a tabletop I did because my kids are very rough on furniture. I've had this now for 12 years. They've jumped on it. They've thrown stuff on it. You can't see a dent in that wood at all. Wonderful wood if you ever want to work with it. It's beautiful. But you have to wipe it with acetone, and you'll get tired of wiping it, and you'll just glue it up anyway. So we get back to the clamping pressure, right? So what we did was we did a test with the Jatoba. Then we took some maple, and we took some poplar. So soft, medium, hardwood. Then we clamped it at 3 different pressures. 5-pound weight on top of it, which worked out to be about 0.6 PSI. Then we took our recommended 100 for the soft, 150 for the maple, and 200 for the Jatoba. And then we went all the way up to 1,000 PSI in a carver press, because there was a paper out in 1998 that said you could go up to 1,000 PSI and it wouldn't affect the strength of the bond. What we found was that in every single case, the 5-pound weight was the strongest bond. But it depended how much you lost in terms of the softness of the wood. And so the poplar as you went from the 5-pound weight to the 1,000 PSI, you really only lost about 10 to 15% of the strength. With the medium density wood, you lost between 25 and 35% of the strength on our recommend, going from the 5-pound weight to the 1,000. On the Jatoba, you lost between 50 to 100% of the strength. In a lot of cases, we pulled it out of the carver press and it just came apart. Now, the reason we asked that, and this kind of goes back to thick glue lines, right? So what we believe is happening is that you are starving the joint of moisture or of glue. And so there isn't enough glue to handle any movement of the wood itself. And so any movement causes the glue line to snap a lot smaller because it doesn't have any stretchability. Most of the glues will move a little bit, right? They're not glass brittle. Where you see like with a CA glue, CA glues can be glass brittle, and in a lot of cases, your camera fell. And in a lot of cases, you know, you drop those and they'll shatter like glass because the glue is so brittle. But with PVA glues, they do move a little bit. And so what we found was the thicker the glue line, the stronger the bond. Up to a certain point, right? I mean, obviously you don't want a 1/4-inch glue line because A, it wouldn't dry fast enough as you would say. But in most of the cases where, you know, they're a little bit thicker, like a 2-sided gluing, or even say I glued something together, then I had to break them apart, had to put a little more glue in and then put them together. Those can look relatively thick and ugly, but they're very strong. They add about 5 to 10% strength to those bonds. So again, we want to just be cognizant of how we're putting things together. We talked a little bit about some of the joints. You have a question?
Well, I have a project where I had to glue ears onto a reindeer. And there was just no way to fit any kind of clamp around it. So what I did was I took a dot of the thick and quick from this side and on the other end, and then I ran a bead of tight bond between it, put it together, held it there for 60 seconds, and then looked up.
Right.
And there was no clamp pressure.
Right.
on
And
the
those
thing
joints
whatsoever.
can be really strong. Because we all, I mean, has anybody ever done a rub joint? Basically a rub joint is you put the glue on the joint, rub it until you feel it putty up, and then stop, and you set it aside. Those joints can be extremely strong. Those will break wood. No clamping pressure. So it makes sense with our observations as we go. Kind of breaks some of those old wives' tales that, well, a little bit of pressure is good, but more pressure is better, right? That's not the case. And in a lot of cases, we kind of understand that because good fitting joinery is a lot stronger than stuff that doesn't fit well, that we're having to really crush the wood together to get it to fit, right? And so that kind of brings me a little bit, let's talk about a Morrison tenon joint. Probably one of the most difficult joints to glue well, okay? So if we're using a water-based wood glue, what happens to the wood? As soon as I put the glue on, what happens? Swells up. So let's say I've got a Morrison tenon joint that fits pretty well. I've got to hammer it a little bit to get it in. I can glue that with water. And that joint is going to hold tremendously well. It's not going to come apart today. Right? But eventually that wood's going to dry back out. How long does it take to, let's say I've got an 8/4 going into an 8/4. How long will it take for 8/4 to air dry? In some cases pretty long, right? So it may fit very well for a very long time. Let's say I'm not gluing it with water though, but I'm using water-based wood glue. So I put the wood glue in there. I've got 1, 2, 3, 4. I got 8 joints that I'm gluing together for this chair. By the time I get it together, I slam it together. I've got to squeeze it all apart. I've just squeezed all of the wood glue off as I'm shoving them together. But the joint feels pretty good. Is it a good joint? I don't know. I don't think it is because In most cases, I've just taken all the glue and scraped it off. Still feels strong. On the opposite side, I've got a joint that, you know, goes together pretty easily. I put the wood glue on, it goes together, it seems fine. But remember, we just talked about wood glue being 50% solids, so it's going to shrink as the glue is going to shrink as it dries also, which may cause the inside of that bond to gap a little bit. Now, if we're looking at a chair that may see some racking, any movement on that chair is going to cause that joint to move and probably break a fiber. Then the next time I do that, it's going to break another fiber, and eventually it's going to loosen up, and we're repairing a chair. And then we tend to repair chairs a lot more than anything else because of the forces on those and the fact that they do tend to have a lot of mortise and tenon joints, right? And so one of the things that even to consider, and we don't make an epoxy, is to make them a little bit loose, not extremely loose, so that they fit together. Use an epoxy, which is not containing any water, and as it cures, it doesn't shrink. So in that particular case, it may support all of those in that particular case. We talked about dovetails. Do you need to glue all of the dovetails? And we talked about no, you don't. Dowels and biscuits. Are they necessary to increase strength on side-to-side joints? Absolutely not. Because a side-to-side joint will break wood. It's as strong as you need it to be. When I add a biscuit or a dowel, what happens is, or a domino, which is a little bit bigger, is I've now cut away a little bit of wood, right? And I've put in pieces of wood that, in a lot of cases, the grain is going in different directions. And let's say I split those boards. Where does the board break? The board will break on the ends of where those dowels are because I just cut away a third of the wood, and now I only have to break a third of the wood to get the dowel to break through, right? So in that particular case, the dowels, the biscuits, and all that really are not there for strength unless you have a end grain to side grain, right? In that particular case, they increase the amount of side grain to side grain, which is going to strengthen that joint, right? But they're really good for alignment, and it allows you to line things up faster. Is that good? Yes. I mean, if you've got like 5 boards you're putting together, you can align them faster, get them clamped before the glue dries. Yes, it's going to be of benefit to you. But is it helping in terms of adding strength to the whole project? Probably not.
Like on the mortise and tenon, would you be, I mean, we all, would it be better leaving the brass or put a little bit of groove in there so that you've got places to move and push it together?
Well, you don't want to, and that's kind of the same thing with a dowel, is you don't want hydro lock. So in a lot of cases, the better glues to use for doweling are really the very thin glues that push out a lot easier. Yeah, I mean, I wouldn't use a very thick glue because you're right. I mean, you can get some type of hydro lock in there. But again, I wouldn't rough the surface up, right?
Well, I was
And
thinking
if it's-
more like taking a chisel and just putting
And the grooves are,
small bead grooves.
but anywhere where that glue is thicker, it's going to shrink more, especially if it's a water base. Now, if it's an epoxy, yeah, not a problem. The epoxy will, how do you say, support all of that and dry as a solid piece of plastic in the same shape that it was when it started to cure, right? And so we just kind of want to be cognizant of what are we doing, what's the glue doing, right? In a lot of cases, it's bonding to the cellulose. Epoxies tend to bond a little bit more to the lignin portion of that. The polyurethanes tend to bond both to the cellulose and a little bit of the lignin, right? So again, we noting how they bond, and that's why sometimes you'll get a better bond in some cases, depending on the joint.
How do you know when the glue is dry? You know, I'll affect the glue joints, how long do you have to wait? And is there any
So-
way to accelerate it?
So my statement to you is, I have absolutely no idea. And the reason I don't is because I don't know what the moisture content of your wood was when you first started. If you're above 15% moisture content, it may take you a month or two. If you're above 17% moisture content, how long is your wood going to take to dry out? That'll be how long the glue is going to be, right? So it doesn't start to dry unless, if the wood is at 17% moisture content, water-based wood glues won't dry. Then you have to use, in most cases, use a polyurethane, which is a moisture curing product, which is going to work. But just note, if you're at 17% moisture content, and you're doing your projects together with 17% moisture content wood, that project's not going to be the same shape when it dries out to what it is when you put it together. So that chair may be a little bit strange.
What's Titebond based?
So the water-based, so our PVAs, the white glues or yellow glues, they're all water-based. We do have a CA glue, which is 2-ethyl cyanoacrylate. When they cure, they harden like glass. They're more like plexiglass, so to speak. You can kind of think of them as, I'm gluing something together with plexiglass, liquid plexiglass, that then it's going to harden. The polyurethanes, they require some relatively tight fitting joints because when they react, they release carbon dioxide, kind of like shaking a can of Coca-Cola up, and that's what causes it to foam. It's the release of the carbon dioxide. If you get foam in the joints, that foam is only about 9 to 30 psi in strength, whereas without the foam in there, you're going to be around 3,000 psi.
You're talking about Gorilla Glue.
Gorilla Glue. We used to have a Titebond polyurethane glue too. We're no longer manufacturing that today because of raw material issues still.
It's too messy for me.
In a lot of cases though, but if you're gluing green wood, if you have to glue green wood together, there's no other glue that you're going to be able to glue that with other than polyurethane.
What glue would you recommend if you're repairing an outdoor wrought iron chair and one of the circular feet, it has 4 feet, which were simply circles of steel. One of them fell off, so I bought a couple of washers, a large one and a small one. I glued those together, and that held.
What did you
with
glue with?
liquid nails.
So
When I glued that washer, the big one and the little one was to go into the base of the wrought iron chair, because the base was only a 1/4 inch on the 4 sides, very thin. It's an old chair, like 60 years old. The liquid nails didn't hold, so I have no idea what glue to use.
So liquid nails tends to be either a solvent-based or water-based product. You put it between 2 pieces of metal, where does the water go? So it's going to stay wet. So it's not going to dry, it's not going to harden up. In a lot of cases, metal to metal, I would go with an epoxy designed for
Epoxy?
designed for metal.
Because I don't have a soldering gun, so.
Right, or weld them together. But yeah, if you want to do metal to metal with a glue, with an adhesive, typically an epoxy is
I
used.
do have epoxy.
Yeah,
Thank you.
and JB Weld is a great glue.
Oh, you're.
Oh yeah, oh
Wait,
yeah.
I can use JB Weld.
You mentioned dominoes, dowels, and biscuits, about the same strength. What about pocket screws?
So the question is pocket screws, and typically you're looking at miter joints or end grain, and they're okay. What happens with screws, long term, is that as that wood expands and contracts, that metal does not. And so eventually those screws will loosen. So I would use glue in there in conjunction with them, and actually put a little bit of glue in the screw holes themselves. And what that's going to do is it's going to glue the screw onto the wood. So then as that wood moves, it's kind of bonded to the screw also, right? So you want everything not to move, because every time something moves other than, you'll break a fiber. And then you break another fiber. So eventually they may break. I mean, if you've ever used screws on an exterior project, eventually those screws either back themselves out or loosen way up, right? And that's because the wood is expanding and contracting quite a bit. Now, you don't get as vicious of that on the interior, right? Because if you maintain a constant moisture content, that wood doesn't move. But who here keeps, 50% relative humidity year round in their house, right? I mean, nobody does. And so eventually that's going to fall apart. Now, is it going to stay together for the 10 to 15 years that you're going to have it in use, right? If it's a cabinetry, right? Most kitchen cabinets, on average, 15 to 30 years before people replace them. Is that going to be long enough? Again, we want to look at our joinery to match what the projects have. What is the requirement of those projects, right? If we want a violin, we don't want to glue it with epoxy because if they break a piece on it, you need to repair. It's got a certain sound to it. So you really don't want to have to break the whole thing apart, right? So that's why in a lot of cases they'll use high glue, because you can steam those pieces apart, right? So again, match the gluing, match the wood, match the joinery to what the project needs to do not only today, but tomorrow, just like the gym floor. You don't want to securely glue it to the floor so that we can't get it up, because it might get flooded one day. Or the boards wear out and we need to replace the boards, and we don't want to have to pull them up as little bitty toothpicks, right? So again, we always want to be cognizant of what that project needs to do.
I have a friend that rebuilds old antique ornaments. If he found that they use some kind of glue like Elmer's or whatever, we won't touch them.
And he's probably a smart guy for doing that, yeah. They can be hard to repair.
Hardware, because when you take these tubes apart, you gotta put them back together. He hits them with a mallet, and the old hide glue, and it just fractures, and it comes right apart.
Yeah.
And you can't do that with any other type of.
Well, actually, CA glues you can fracture pretty easily. The CA glues will fracture, but I wouldn't put any, it just doesn't move with the wood, and eventually those tend to fall apart anyway. So, that's all I have for you guys. I'm gonna stick around for questions.
I edge glue two boards together with a squeeze out. Do you like a bent cloth and wipe that then, or wait a while and take it off with a chisel? Or
So what we have found, so we did a test. This is basically how do you remove squeeze out. So our recommendation typically, and again, I've got free samples up here for you guys. So I've got Glue Brush and our new Quick and Thick, Speed Set. The Speed Set is like Quick and Thick, only it's very thin, so I call it kind of quick and thin. But it's very high solids like that. So normally we would say wait 20 minutes and then scrape it out, right? This end is a plastic, won't mar the wood and all of that. But what we found, so there was a video on YouTube where a guy was making an 8-quarter walnut tabletop. And he was putting dominoes in them and squeezing glue all over. It was type on 3, so we were like happy, And he had glue running all over the place. And we're like, but then he took a big wet rag. He put up his hand and the guy off screen threw him a rag and you heard it hit his hand and it just went slop. Right? And he started wiping it, water's all over the place, and we're like, so being the scientist that I am, I wanted to prove that that wasn't the best way to do it. And so we did a test and we found out that that was actually the best way of doing it. So as long as you use a very wet rag and kind of dilute that glue way down, getting it up, right? And then kind of dry it off and get that up off the surface. Actually all it does is it kind of erases the grain, and you got like a less than a minute. So how we tested, we took a random orbital sander with a 5-pound weight on top, and we moved it along the glue line. We only did, 18-inch boards. And so for less than a minute it took to get to where you could stain it without any glue line marks. Scraping it off took about a minute and 10 seconds. So if you wait the 20 minutes, they're relatively close, but really the one with the water, we can't say that it's bad. If you wait until the glue dries, it'll take chunks of wood out, and that's a lot of sanding. we recommend 20 minutes, we still do. But if you want to use a wet rag, go ahead. If you use a moist rag, one that isn't sloppy wet, you can push the glue into the wood, and that can cause some issues with stainability. And it can cause some longer sanding times to get that done. Now the glue that we have here, which is the Speed Set, does have a UV light dye in it. So under a black light, it'll shine so you can see where you need to sand it off before you stain. So, but anyway, so you guys have got samples there. Thank you. I'm going to stick around until all the questions are done, but thank you.
One more announcement. We have an open house, open shop, May 20th at Bob Booth's. He's going to demonstrate a CNC machine. There's going to be 2 sessions on that Saturday at 9 a.m. and 11 a.m. And you can register for it on the website calendar. Okay, that's all I have. That's it. You want to move your chair?
I'll just show you the chair, and then if you have questions, we'll do it after the fact. So
Okay.
I'll just take 5 seconds here. Before COVID, I started working on this chair, and COVID gave me the opportunity to finish this chair. This is my interpretation of a Blacker House chair, for those of you that are aware of it. Multiple bent laminations, multiple stringings in it, multiple ebony plugs in it, all that sort of stuff, splines, all that. So if you have questions, come to me after the fact. Sure. So that people can get going if they need to get going.
Thank you, Frank. And then one thing I want to mention, Bob Fox, he's offered if anybody wants to get with him to use his shop, if you don't have one of your own, if you just want to work together and so forth, please see Bob and talk with him or give him a call. And
I do have this.
Sorry.
I'll pass it around. If you want to learn a lot more about wood, this is an excellent book. Understanding Wood. I'll pass it around.
Yeah, my presentation is kind of taken from that book.
We have some stuff to give away real quick. You want to go ahead and just draw some numbers real quick? For the
A month ago, at the board meeting, well, back up further than that, 1 or 2 years, we had to stop having a 50-50 drawing because the state wants to take a portion of our earnings from that, so we dropped it totally. But then I came up with the idea of having donated items given away to the members by the lottery ticket system. So I brought in 4 or 5 things last month. Some other gentleman brought in stuff for tonight. Who is he and where is he? Do you want to show us what you have?
Two furniture clamps are probably the most sought after. A stud finder, a unique piece of Martin Pen eyeglasses, and a hammer. A regular, well-used ball peen hammer. So anyway, you get whatever your number on the ticket.
Then, just before the meeting, another gentleman brought in 4 books. Who brought them in? This gentleman. I've separated it into 2 lots. 2 of them are on cabinet working. 2 of them are on general woodworking. we don't have a cap for
These are
tickets.
these are the same book.
Yeah, those are the same book.
They're the same book, just different cover.
Lots into one of each.
Yep. There you go. Yeah, there's four. Just four.
Draw some numbers, please.
So-
Last two digits.
Yeah, real quick, get through this. Last two digits. If you're called, just come up here and grab what you want. 01501.
Here,
All right.
You get your pick.
the clamp.
I think you get two of them.
94. 94. You want?
Actually, at 9.
Yep.
Draw another number. Let's pick 2 or 3 numbers ahead.
What do you want, sir? The hammer. Okay.
02.
Be careful.
02. Oh, you want a book?
Pass on the books.
93. This one?
Okay.
91. 91. No? No 91? Alright, moving on. 03.
Give me one of those books, please.
82. You want? You said you want to take a look at that?
Is it wood, Bob?
Next number.
Yeah, that's fine.
96.
What do you want?
Oh, pass them. Or these.
Or Vance Woodwork and Furniture Maker. What do you want?
Let's do the advanced furniture maker.
81.
Goggles and one book.
Goggles and cabinet making.
And the goggles go to 06. Oh, and real quick, we do have a guest tonight.
This is my son Kim. He works for LRS, and he's not so much a woodworker as he is in a remodeling mode at their house, finishing the basement, including the electrical and the plumbing for a bathroom.
Well, first of all, I want to thank Bob for coming out tonight and coming down this way.
Thanks for inviting me, guys.
And thank you all for coming. It's about time to, there's still a little time if you want to stay and visit afterwards, ask questions and so forth. You don't have to rush out of